Welcome to the Book Show, a celebration of reading and writers. I'm Joe Donahue. New York Times best-selling novelist Imbolo Mbue's new novel, How Beautiful We Were, is a sweeping, wrenching story about the collision of a small African village and an American oil company. The story opens in the African village of Kasawa, where a U.S. oil company operating in the area has poisoned much of the air, water, and food. Many have died, many more are sick. But the company is protected by corrupt local officials and the nation's powerful dictator. The story is told from the perspectives of a generation of children and the family of a girl named Tula, who grows up to become a revolutionary. Imbolo Mbue won the Pen Faulkner Award for her debut novel, Behold the Dreamers, and it is a great pleasure to welcome Imbolo Mbue back to our program this morning. Thank you so much for being with us. What a delight to have you back.
Thank you so much for having me back, Joe.
So what brought you to this novel? Because from my understanding, you were actually working on this prior to Behold the Dreamers.
Yes, so I started writing this novel in 2002. So that was way back in, I guess, 19 years now ago that I started writing it. And this is the first thing I started writing the moment I decided to start writing. I had this idea to tell the story of this community in Africa and what it was like for them to make that very difficult decision to fight back against forces that are way more powerful than themselves. But the thing is that I didn't exactly know how to write back then. I didn't understand the craft. I didn't understand character or plot or pacing. I didn't know any of that. But I was invested in it because this is a story that mattered to me. And I spent the next 9 years writing and rewriting it. It really wasn't going anywhere, but I just kept on writing it. I didn't have any grand ambitions of becoming a writer. During the time I was writing it in those first 9 years, I went to graduate school. I got a master's in education and psychology. I worked for a nonprofit in substance abuse treatment. I had a corporate job. This was something that I just did on the side because this story mattered to me. And then in 2011, after 9 years of writing it, I went for a walk one day in Midtown Manhattan and I noticed chauffeurs waiting on a street corner. And I became fascinated about what it's like to be a chauffeur, to have a chauffeur. So I started writing a story about this chauffeur who is an immigrant and a Wall Street executive he works for, and what happens when both families collide during the financial crisis. Having this inspiration to write this new story was such a breath of fresh air because it allowed me to come back to New York City, right? For all these years, I've been living in this fictional African village. And so here I was writing a story where characters were taking the subway and characters were sitting at Colombo Circle. And it was a lot closer to my life than this village I had never been to, except in my head. And so that was such a joy. And then that book came out in 2016. But the moment it came out, I just knew that I had to go back to that old story. The story just would not stop haunting me. It wouldn't stop calling me back. All of the characters in the novel, they just stayed with me. So the moment my first novel came out, I went right back to it and I started writing. And by then, I had obviously become a better writer. I had grown as a person and had gained a lot of confidence from writing my first book. And so I was able to finish the project.
So give us a sense of the background in the story, because this is a fictional African village, Kasawa, and yet it does somewhat resemble the village you came from.
Not quite, because I am from a town called Limbe. It is a town in the southern part of Cameroon. It's actually, at this point, it's more of a little city. Also, I spent my early childhood in a couple of African villages, but they were not my villages. My mother worked for the government, and because of my mother's job, we got to live in a couple of villages. But neither of them was like the village in this novel. The villages in which I lived in were fairly modern. Some people, they had electricity, some people had televisions, unlike this village where pretty much everybody lives in huts. And some people lived in huts in the villages in which I grew up. So that didn't come from my experience of having a village like that, because my hometown, like I said, is a fairly cosmopolitan city by African standards. I grew up reading a lot of literature by African writers, which were set in villages like Kosawa. And so that was a great exposure to me. I also grew up in a town. My hometown of Limbe had oil, much like this village of Kosawa. So I even as a child, I was very aware of the politics of oil. I was very aware that people whose land the oil is under usually don't benefit from the oil as much as the country's powerful elite.
Yes, and that is what I meant, which I didn't clarify. That the similarity is the connection to the oil and knowing the politics. Which one of the things that you so beautifully illustrate in this book is that in reading the novel, we look at
Mm.
this through the perspective of an African village.
Mm-hmm.
And as Tula comes to the United States, we learn that, well, it's really not all that different. These the corporate greed and the environmental issues that take place
Mm-hmm.
are not that uncommon.
That's right. That's right. And that is something which I had to also the realization really helped me in this book because while, like you said, it's set in a fictional African village, I was inspired by similar stories all around the world. So I went back to writing this story in 2016. And at that point, so much had happened as far as environmental degradation around the world. We had the BP oil spill happen in America, and even till this day, the Gulf of Mexico still needs a lot of work to get back. If we don't know when it's going to get back to what it used to be. 2016, I was also writing at the time when I was finishing that Standing Rock was happening, and that involved pipelines. There was a lot of talk about fracking and what that does to the environment. There's also the issue of Chevron, and I don't know if many people know about Chevron and the environmental degradation in Ecuador, and how many people have lost their lives and how the environment there has been destroyed. So while it was I put it in this fictional African village, I was inspired by a lot of stories of corporations really not thinking much about the consequences of destroying the environment for the sake of profit.
I would like to talk about the beginning of the novel because, as I mentioned in the introduction, it is told from many different perspectives, from a
Mm-hmm.
group of children to Tula herself, to Tula's brother, mother,
Mm-hmm.
and others. But the novel starts out just with a voice,
Mm-hmm.
and it sets the scene, and that scene is very graphic because it is the company coming to the town and the village's madman
Mm-hmm.
taking matters into his own hands.
Right, yes. Like when the story starts, like you said, and we see this village where there's been so much contamination going on for years. The rivers are covered with toxic waste, the pipelines are spilling, the air is just really dirty, and the children in the village are suffering because of this. The whole village is suffering because it really is not healthy to live in such a contaminated environment. And all the corporation does is say, oh, we'll take care of you guys, don't worry, we'll fix everything, and they're not doing anything. And then when the story starts, the village is feeling very helpless until the village madman says, hold up, guys. We can do something about this. We can fight this corporation. And his tactics, like you said, it could be considered graphic, but it is just a matter of using what they have at their disposal, which is a strategy which none of the villagers had thought about until the madman thought about it, and that is what set the stage for this struggle and this long battle between this village and this oil company, and the whole thing lasts for almost 40 years.
Yes, this is a generational story, and we see that most obviously in the children who tell the
Mm-hmm.
story, as you call them, the children and their perspective. And at the beginning of the novel, they are indeed children. By the end
Mm-hmm.
of the novel, they are much, much older, and they
Mm-hmm.
have seen this play out over
Mm-hmm.
a long period of time. What led you to want to do it that way? Multiple voices and
Mm-hmm.
singular and group voices.
Right. Yeah. So the children's voices was very much inspired by events that had happened in America. So when I started writing this novel in 2002, it was told in just a first person singular voice of Tula, who is the young girl who grows up to become a revolutionary. Obviously that was not working, but that is part of why the story was not working, because this is a story about the community as a whole, as well as it is about these individual characters. So when I went back to it in 2016, a lot had happened in America to children that had really devastated me, and I'm talking specifically about Sandy Hook and also about Flint, Michigan. And I was thinking a lot about what it's like to be a child in a world in which you feel as if not enough is being done to protect you. So I imagined, say, the children in Flint, Michigan, because they have something in common with the children in this village as far as the water, because the children in the village are drinking poisoned water. And so it was similar to the case in Flint, Michigan. And I was thinking about what it's like to be a child and to be wondering and questioning the world, because I was a sensitive child myself. So that is why I decided to put it in the voice of the children, to show them as one going through life in this village and watching their parents fight, watching the sacrifices their parents had to make, watching the tough decisions their parents had to make, and then one day having to inherit this struggle and also have to make tough choices themselves. And as far as the other perspective, I also wanted to show the cost of this struggle on one particular family, the family of the girl who became the leader. Because what we don't think about when we think about the great leaders, the Dr. Kings and the Malcolm X and the Mandelas, we don't really think about what their families went through for their choices. And it is a very difficult, I mean, I read a lot of biographies and memoirs of a lot of the 20th century's greatest revolutionaries. And Tula is a composite of these great men. I just made her a woman because I thought that a woman can also do what those men did.
Absolutely.
But I wanted to also show the personal and individual cost of taking a stand against a corporation or taking a stand against anybody, anything that you feel as if is treating you unjustly. What is involved? What is the price you and your family have to pay for taking that stand? So that is why it was important to me that I show the point, show the Tula's family's perspective, and also they allowed me to shed light on Tula, also to show Tula as this flawed character. Even though she's fighting for justice, she's also very flawed.
We are speaking to Imbolo Mbue about her new novel, How Beautiful We Were, and it is published by Random House. Yes, Tula is a flawed character, but she is so interesting. There's one, I believe it is her mother, at one point in the novel refers to her as enigmatic. And that's almost 2/3 through the book, but it very much is her character, right? Is a very enigmatic child who grows up to be an enigmatic revolutionary.
Yes, that's a great way of putting it. She's so internal, right? She's, even as a child, she's so full of rage. Like early on when we meet her, she's talking about how she's going to make this oil company pay. It's odd to see a 10-year-old girl already dreaming of, I'm going to make this corporation pay for what they've done to my community and my family. So but she doesn't exactly talk a lot. This is a child who kind of finds herself through books. She at one point, some Americans come to the village and they give books, and it was through these books that Tula starts having ideas about the fact that she could learn about the world and she could use that knowledge to do something. Now, how she uses that knowledge and whether it actually does something, that is up to the reader to decide. But Tula is an example of what happens when you educate a woman, right? Like, great things can happen when you educate a woman. And she had to fight really hard to get an education. And what she did, she comes to America and gets an education, and she uses a lot of American ideals. She learns about democracy, she learns about protest movements, and she decides to take it and do something similar in her country.
You write in the novel, we hated that we went to bed in fear and woke up in fear all day long, breathed fear in and out. Our mothers and fathers told us to have no worries, for the Spirit would guide and protect us, but their words brought us no comfort. The Spirit had protected the other children, and what had become of them? You write a lot about the Spirit which guides many of the characters and many of those in this village of Kosawa. And it really is a presence where there is a belief and a hope, and yet some fear as well.
Yes, and that is something that the characters have to wrestle with, because they have this belief in the Spirit. They consider themselves to be part of something bigger, and yet the things happen in the story that makes them question, makes them question the Spirit, makes them question the omnipotence of the Spirit. How powerful the Spirit is, that the Spirit is allowing a corporation to destroy their land. But one of the reason why these villagers fight so hard for their land is because they have a strong connection to who they are, and the spiritual element is part of it, and the fact that they believe that their ancestors are waiting for them somewhere, and that they have to leave this land for their children so that they can continue that, just like they got it from their ancestors. They have to pass it on to their children. So it's not just a piece of land, it is the essence of who they are. And that is a huge part of why they obviously are so motivated to do something, even though it comes with a tremendous amount of sacrifice.
There is one point where Tula's grandmother is telling the story and is telling about Christians who have come to the village and trying to spread their religion, and how, for want of a better word, silly they find that to be. And obviously the Christians find the spirit to be silly. And it's amusing as to that perspective of this wise woman who is telling the tale in that particular section of the novel.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about it, with colonialism is quite ridiculous. Right? To come to find a people and tell them your ways are not as wonderful, adopt my ways, speak my language, take my religion, your ways are going to lead you to hell and damnation. There's something very ridiculous about the whole idea. And even though that the story leads to a place where you see how that colonialism ends up leading to a lot of what the villagers held sacred. What Tula's grandmother is doing, and she's talking about back when she was young, way before Tula was born, how they didn't even imagine that the Christianity that was almost tried to force upon them, that they thought that was bad, but it was nothing compared to the oil company arriving and destroying their land. So Tula's grandmother offers a perspective on the history of the village, on all what this village has been through, from the time when slave masters tried to come and take slaves from the village, to the time when the colonial masters arrived, and now the village is under the power of a dictator, because the country in which it is located is a dictatorship.
Imbolo Mbue is our guest. The new novel is How Beautiful We Were. This intersection of violence and just horrendous things that are happening as a result of the oil that they are living on top of in this village is quite striking. As if things weren't bad enough with children and adults dying as a result of this pollution, there is also what is happening with the company and happening with the government, and the violence that ultimately occurs a few times in the novel. It does give a helpless feeling, doesn't it, that you write about in the village. There really is nowhere to go, and even the safety of that hut has been breached.
Very true, Joe. That is one of the reasons why this was a very painful story to write, because while you can admire the villagers taking a stand, the odds against them are just really, really high. And so, like you said, they try one strategy and then they get destroyed, and they try another one, maybe they get a minor victory, but they only last for so long. So is this continuous cycle of one thing after another. But at the same time, it was important to me that I don't portray the characters in the village as being wonderful, perfect people just because they're fighting for justice. It was important to me that I show them as humans who are flawed. So from the village madman to Tula, to Tula's father, her mother, all of Tula's friends who eventually become somewhat of her disciples in this fight. It was important that I show them as just full humans in their full complexity. And just the same way I wanted to show the oil company employees as also humans. Because just because you work at an oil company doesn't make you a bad person. There were people at the oil company who tried to do their best to help this village. Maybe their motivations were not exactly the cleanest, but they did make an effort to do something. So I wanted to show the full scope of the complexity involved in such a struggle, and how good guys can have bad motivations, and people who work for not so wonderful corporations can actually have good motivations.
Yes, that is fascinating, because there are characters in the novel who have to be involved with the company because the company is so omnipresent, and there is nowhere else for them to work, and it is what they need to do to keep their family safe and alive.
That's right.
When you started this, I'm interested if the scope was always to be as generational as it became.
It was generational, but not to this extent. It was very much about Tula. It started with Tula. It always started with Tula as a girl and ended up with Tula as an adult. So that part never changed, but it didn't go for 40 years the way it is now. But it was important to me that I show from the beginning, right, from the day the struggle started to when the struggle somewhat ended with, and I won't say how it ended. So that definitely required that I show generations and even go into the past, because this story also goes into Tula's grandfather, who was born, at a very different time, and how he saw the oil company and how that relationship affected Tula's father, and how a lot of decisions that people make has a lot to do with the people who came before them and the kind of decisions that they also make. I did a lot of research with this novel. I looked at a lot of movements around the world, like, for example, the civil rights movement. So if you think about what African Americans have gone through, it wasn't just one group of people who started the fight and then it was over, right? A group of people started it and then they passed on to the next generation and the next generation, and it goes on. And today we are where we are with Black Lives Matter. So it was important that I show that evolution of the struggle, and not just the way one group of people fought, but how the way they fought affected the next generation.
There are many ways that the characters fight in this novel. One of the ways is legal, and Tula is working on that and bringing this matter to the courts. It ultimately starts in courts in the United States. And without giving too much away, what I find interesting is that there are deficiencies in all of these court systems. And at one point, one of the characters says, well, perhaps we should bring this to European courts. And so this idea of other countries intervening in this country and in this village, and yes, they're looking for help, but they're also saying, yeah, we don't want to get involved.
Right, right. And that was also a lot of research. I had to look into how does an African village sue an American corporation in an American court. You don't hear a lot of success stories about that because it's just very difficult. So I had to show the different ways in which they could try to do that. And I didn't go into too much of that, but it was important that I really look at it. And the case of the people in Ecuador versus Chevron was a good example. So I studied that case because that is a case that has lingered in American courts for a very long time. And the people of Ecuador still haven't had much success. And they actually took it to European courts also, and still nothing much has happened there because it's a very complicated case, like these things usually are. And so I wanted to show that angle also. I also wanted the role the US media played, because in this novel we also have an American journalist, right?
Right.
And the American journalist comes, and whatever he does or doesn't do, it ends up affecting the village and it has consequences. And then it was important that I also show the roles that a non-profit does, because we have a lot of non-profits that are American Europeans going to try to help African villages, and everything gets complicated. So this is the story because it's set from 1980 to 2020. There were so many different factors coming there, international relations, the relationship that the dictator has with Western powers and the US media, the way they reported on the story, and the US courts, the role they played, and how all of that affected this village. And the village was just doing their part. But this is an issue that has to do with the way the world is right now. We live in a very globalized environment. This is the age of globalization. So while this was just a small village, a lot of what happened there, not everything, but a lot of what happened there was a bigger picture to it as far as their place in the world, and how outside forces like the media and the US courts, and the way the relationship between the Western powers and the dictatorship, how all of that ended up affecting them.
You do the most fascinating thing in that, because there is that big picture and the media being one part of that big picture. And yet in this journalist, and because it is a generational tale, we see how beleaguered that journalist comes.
Yes.
And the toll that it takes
Yes.
in this fight.
Yeah, it did, and I do. That was one of my favorite characters. I really like that character because you can really see how a journalist can say, "I am going to tell the world about atrocities that corporations are doing somewhere," and they also realize that you can inform the world all you want, but that is not necessarily going to bring about change, right? There's a
Right.
lot that needs to happen. And even the kind-hearted American nonprofit, and the nonprofit comes and they also have ideas, and they also see just how far they can go. I mean, people ask all the time, oh, how come we're giving all this money to nonprofits to help so and so countries and so issue, nothing is happening? I learned from my research that it's just like life. These issues are also complex. And so it takes lots of intervening factors for certain results to happen. And Kosawa is an example of how so much was done, but there were forces that were way more powerful, and the villagers were just, they could only do so much. And the way the story ended, I mean, you have to decide first the way you think of it, but it is an ending that shows what happens when all of these factors intersect in one small African village.
And again, without giving anything away, but it does make you wonder whether African villages like Kasawa can survive. And quite frankly, as we noted a few moments ago, of whether places with great environmental strife in this country can survive.
Yes, I mean, it is a very good point, Joe, because the struggle is real. The struggle is difficult. I mean, most Americans don't know about, DuPont and Parkersburg, West Virginia, and how the people of Parkersburg, West Virginia, they struggled for years. And it was a very difficult uphill battle to bring DuPont to justice for the environmental contamination over there. And so these issues take a long time to resolve. These issues involve a lot of loss of life and sacrifice and so many different factors. And so, even though, like we said, it's a small African village, there are major towns that could not survive a lot of things. There are major towns in the American Midwest that could not survive globalization. So it is not only the African village. I use this place because I am African, and I understand that. But Kosawa could be anywhere in the world. Kosawa could be in America.
The book is absolutely beautiful, and it is entitled How Beautiful We Were. Imbolo Mbue, I thank you so much for being with us. What a great pleasure to have you on the program, and an absolute delight, as always, to speak with you.
Thank you so much for having me, Joe.
Again, Imbolo Mbue's new novel is How Beautiful We Were. It is published by Random House. We enjoy hearing from our listeners about our shows. You can email us at book@wamc.org. You can listen again to this or find past book shows via podcast or at wamc.org. Sarah LeDuc produces our program. Bookmark us for next week. And thanks for listening for The Book Show. I'm Joe Donahue.